Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode, I sat down with Darcy Spady. The Canadian energy and climate dynamics under the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, are getting a very centrist shake-up, with the federal government working closely with provinces, in particular Alberta, to find the balance between developing Canada's resources while still focusing on reducing emissions at the same time. Darcy brings together expertise from both the oil and gas space and the climate space, and I had a great time diving into some of the recent announcements, as well as what that means for Canada more broadly as they look to grow their trade partnerships outside of the US. This is the last episode for this season, so thank you to all of my guests and to all of you who've joined me over the last few months. We'll be back in the new year with more discussions that continue to find that balance between energy development and climate policy. Please make sure that you don't miss out by liking and subscribing to the channel. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Darcy. Hey, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Navigating Carbon podcast. Today, I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Darcy Spady. Darcy, how are you?
I am great.
It's so good to see you. We haven't been able to catch up in person for a while, but it's always lovely to be able to sit down and chat as we're heading into the year end. So, thank you for joining me. We got
You're
a lot to
very
talk about.
welcome. Look forward to it.
Yeah. So for folks that don't know you, you're sitting up in Calgary, up in Canada. And there's been a lot going on in the Canadian climate and energy policy, particularly after Mark Carney came in and stuff. So we were going to kind of unpack a bit of it today in terms of like what's going on. So, yeah.
I hope
Um,
maybe I can learn something or hold it. Am I the expert?
I hope so. No, am I? I'm the Australian that sits in the US.
Yeah.
So let's just, for folks that aren't familiar with the Canadian oil and gas market generally, like, can you just give us some context on the market up in Canada with, some of the different types of production and kind of some of the recent stuff that's been going on?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting market. We've always been a bit pipeline constrained. Maybe not always, but in the last decade or two, we've been a bit pipeline constrained. Um, so there's always been, lots of availability of gas prospects, but not a lot of takeaway.
Mm.
And then oil, we have limited refining, so pipelines are always the bottleneck. Um, Recently, that's changed a little bit, and what happens, how it affects Canadians, is we get bumped out of the delivery system to refineries. So we pay a pretty large differential because we have to ship our product, and so that's always been the complaint up here. Is the differential is high? I'm not making money. West Texas can be at $65, and the Canadian price is 25 or 30. I mean, it's been really bad
That's
in
bad.
in years gone by. So we are moving along, and one of the changes in the last few years is our lifting cost has actually gone down because we've brought on stream a lot of heavy oil with steam assisted SAGD technology.
Okay.
So SAGD's kind of changed the market in that you have very high cost drilling and production facilities that you put in place, long horizontals with twinned steam wellbores. But once that factory is working, that produces like a factory. You don't
Mm.
have to drill all the time to stay ahead of the curve. So there's a couple dynamics that have really changed here in the Canadian market. One is our oil lifting cost in general, I believe, has gone down. Now, the facts may not bear out exactly, but my feeling is we've got lower lifting costs across the board because of SAGD being so prevalent. And the second thing is we have a little more access to market with a recent pipeline that's gone to Tidewater. So things are good, but the traditional rig count is not, high when it's good and low when it's bad. It's not as much of a
Mm.
factor anymore with horizontal wells, pad drilling. All these things have affected to where we're getting just as much output, but not necessarily all the typical indicators that we're busy.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people are often surprised, right? Like, and I forget exactly the stats on it, but like Canada's like the fifth largest oil producer is it fifth and like fifth
Fourth or
largest gas?
fifth. Yep.
Yeah, it always kind of shifts a little bit. But like in terms of global market, like we're talking about what, 5 million barrels a day or something like that
Yes.
into the global market of oil. And I can never remember the gas number, but Canada's like fifth or sixth on the gas side as well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's
Depending
a
on
huge
the day, it's
area.
fourth in oil, fifth in gas,
Yeah,
something like that, which is massive.
yeah. And you talked about the takeaway capacity on the oil side, but like the LN Canada is LNG Canada coming online earlier this year. Again, the gas differentials in Canada have been brutal for producers over the
Brutal.
last few years
Brutal.
as well. I
Yeah,
think was I talking to someone? Was I correct that maybe prices went negative this year or something like
yeah,
that? But like,
yeah.
talk about or like, what are you seeing with people talking about the prospect of LNG now in terms of takeaway capacity on the gas side?
Well, we do have one LNG facility that's operational. Recently, it's been announced the second train there and a second one coming on stream, uh, I think 2 years, year and a half. So we've suddenly got a lot of export takeaway through LNG, which thank goodness we've got it because we should have been uh, similar timing with the US, but for whatever reason, we didn't.
Yep,
And as LNG has grown, we have not kept pace. So this is very much catch up. There's
yep,
no reason why we shouldn't have strong LNG exports, but we finally got it. So I'm not going to complain. It started. Um, Ironically, the most of the gas is in the province of British Columbia, or I shouldn't say most. A lot of the gas is in the province of British Columbia, well up into the north. So it's all part of the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, which is on the eastern flank of the Rockies, but
okay,
it all comes around and goes out to the west coast
yeah,
at north of Vancouver, near Alaska actually,
mm,
and but it's a big resource in northeastern BC, northwestern Alberta that's been in the reservoir for years. They're finally unlocking it and putting it in that LNG pipeline. So
yeah.
it's a bit of a journey,
It
but
has been, yeah,
we've sold a lot of LNG through other ports like Houston and New Orleans over the years.
yep.
So those molecules are getting to move outside, a different direction, which is great for takeaway.
It's well, and we'll talk a little bit about this separately, as well, but, like, having a Western, like, Pacific Ocean access with more direct route to Asia is really interesting for North America. I think it's a really interesting kinda dynamic there as well, and we might talk about a little bit of that here in a bit, but, it has taken a long time to I remember I think I sat on a panel in, like, 2018 or something in Calgary and
Yeah.
was asked about Canadian LNG, and I was like, "It's never gonna happen." And everyone was like, "Oh," and it finally happened, so I was wrong, but it did take a long time to your
Well,
point.
it
Like
almost didn't.
yeah,
And you know what? It didn't at the time. We had
yeah,
some very strong political
yeah.
situations that
Headwinds.
made it
Yep.
painful. I'll just say that.
So yeah, so it's an interesting kind of piece. So that's kind of some of the context around the energy market and the oil and
Hmm.
gas space. So like let's talk about some of the context of the Canadian climate market and things like that. So
Hmm.
you're you're in Alberta, but I know you've got a lot of stuff in BC and things like that as well. But like Canadian federally has rules in place and stuff. Can you kind of give a little bit around just a little bit of context of some of the like environmental climate kind of stuff between the states and the federal and give
Yeah.
people a little bit of a context on that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting and it's different, and the U.S. is our neighbor, but we're very different in some ways.
Yeah.
And probably the first key difference that people often forget, including us, is that our mineral rights system is by and large completely different
Mm.
than the U.S. And the U.S. is probably different than the rest of the world. Um, in the U.S., a lot of places have privately held mineral rights. Most places, I guess, in the U.S. onshore.
Mhm.
In Canada, there's a very small amount of that, but by and large, broad brushing here, the Crown, the government, owns the mineral rights. So you have a whole different ownership structure where climate and climate mitigation and carbon pricing is very much a government thing because they're the owner of the resource. And that puts, it puts a bit of a different spin on it. There is an obligation of the government to do something on the global stage, but they also own the resource. So they can say, slow down drilling, don't flare, do this, do that. Similar to in the US, I guess it would be parts of the North Slope or the Gulf of Mexico where the government owns the rights. So it's
Yeah.
our system is by and large government owned for the resource, and the resource also ties very strongly into the environmental side. So governments have a little bit stronger position in Canada on needing to on climate policy and how it relates to the industry. And I can remember in about it was about 2000, a little after 2000, some of the rules that came into us as operators, and I was a small operator at the time. They were very stringent, and we screamed very loudly. But it was the government, and they own the mineral rights, so you just
Yeah, you
do
have
as
to.
they say. Consequently, fast forward, 20 years, 15 years, we have a very, very robust regulatory system in each province. They're all different, but by and large, the provinces are very ownership oriented and take it very seriously. So it's not like a policeman running after you, giving you a ticket if
Oh.
you're in violation. It's a yearly filing that if you're not complying on, you're in big trouble. And so we've had a very robust set of environmental regulations, and especially as it relates to flaring, like unless it's an emergency, you have a certain allotment per year, and if you're over that, you're in trouble. So
Mm.
it's forced the Canadian market, particularly Alberta, to have some very smart ideas in reducing emissions. For instance, Alberta specifically has a tier system. Now I don't
It's
know
an
that.
acronym, isn't it? I always get so confused. It was a very clever acronym because I always just thought they were genuinely meaning tears, but I forget what it is. There is an acronym associated
Uh,
with it, but
yeah. And basically what happens is if you're over your large emitter limit, uh, you have three choices. You can pay a tax on it, which goes into a special tier fund. uh, you can remove the emission by doing something about it, or you can offset it with credits, which therefore props up a very robust credit market
mm,
because it's actually tradable with in a monetary sense. So an operator, if they've got, for instance, uh, a lot of pneumatic devices that pollute, they can buy offsets, or they can pay the tax on them, or they can replace them, and that replacement could be financed, and often is financed through offsets as opposed to cash. So
yeah,
we have a very sophisticated and robust system, partly because it's not enforcement is done by the resource owner, the government.
yeah, which
So
makes
it
sense.
I think it's an excellent example of industry working with government, and actually being a monetary incentive as well as efficiency, and
Yeah.
of course reducing emissions. I'm not sure if that's a good overview, but that's kind of the difference.
I think it is, and I mean, it's a big difference. I did just look up what TIA stands for as well: technology, innovation, and emissions reduction. So
That's
yeah,
it.
there we go. I knew I could never. There's so many acronyms in this space; it's always difficult to
Yeah.
remember them all. But it does, to your point, like it is even the name of it, right? It's around how do you find, instead of just penalizing, in this case, oil and gas, but it could be any industry, right? Instead of just
Mhm.
penalizing, how do you create incentives? How do you create financial incentives to drive innovation, to figure out where the efficiencies are, where people can, think about some really practical examples of reducing things like methane or methane, depending on what part of the world you're in.
Yeah.
And, I think we have seen some of that out of Canada, and particularly around things like CCUS, where with a price on carbon, it starts to be like, okay, well, um, what does that look like in terms of, these big capital investments for something like carbon capture? And companies can then actually make financial decisions because instead of just being forced to a certain extent, right? Like it's to your point around like how do we all figure this out and work together? In some aspects. I don't know if you wanted to touch on. I know you were quite involved in some of the methane specific rules and stuff. I don't know if you want to touch on kind of what you saw in that space and sort of the evolution of what's been put in place and how companies are really sort of thinking about their methane kind of footprint as well. With that,
Yeah, I can talk a bit to that. I think we've done a tremendous job here in Alberta, and our two neighboring provinces each have their own system. So British Columbia's is maybe a little more robust. Saskatchewan is a little more oil focused, so a little less than Alberta, I'd say. But what the tight um, and robust methane rules, or emissions rules, allowed us to do is become very efficient as an industry. Flaring is inefficient.
yeah,
That's sales gas. pneumatic devices are inefficient. That's some it seemed like a great idea 30 years ago to use the the energy of the gas pressure, but it's a bad thing. And so to me, these are easy wins where the industry looks really good. We're reducing emissions, we're reducing methane emissions, which are, 25 to 85% more potent than CO2, depending on your time frame. So we've been able to really up the efficiency and really clean up our act as an industry, if you will, um, to the point where flare is a very odd thing. It's not routine, and
Yeah.
you won't be able to do things like that if your excuse is I'm too far from the pipeline. It's like figure
Yeah.
something out. So I'm very proud of what we've done. Where we failed is we haven't monetized that skill set globally.
Hmm.
We could be and should be the talk of the town everywhere in this space, and we're just kind of happy to do our thing and move along and do it in a good way. So
Hmm.
we've got a very impressive track record, and since Europe has the dynamics have changed, and suddenly gas is a necessity for heating,
Yep.
and energy poverty has come into play. Suddenly we look really good, but I think as Canadians we need to talk about how we did it, talk about buy-in of industry,
Yeah.
talk about the positive sides of emission reduction, because it can actually make your money make the company money in an efficiency manner. And these are
Yeah.
things we have to celebrate, as opposed to always treating the regulator as a policeman ready to catch us, and
Yeah.
avoidance and all this mentality. We don't need that. We are a clean, organized, safe industry, and it's finally coming to be known as that. I mean, our new prime minister has certainly looked at that and embraced some of the resource provinces and said, no, we want to be an energy superpower.
Yeah.
We also want to be a climate conscious
Yep.
energy superpower. So
It's
this
a
is really
really,
great.
yeah, it's a really good segue because this is why we wanted to sit down and have this
Mhm.
conversation around some of this. And I think because there's so much to unpack there, where there's a few different pieces I kind of want to pull apart with this because you the first bit is around actually just sort of the general public perception on some of this. I was curious to kind of see, coming from Australia, we have a similar kind of mineral system that Canada does, where it's
Yep,
again the crown owns the minerals, which is how most of this is around the world. To be honest, like you said, the US is
yep,
very unique in its mineral
yeah,
interest, private ownership, and it's where then there is much more public pressure on the government to potentially regulate and police industry and some of that kind of stuff. So, I'm curious, particularly as you're talking about like how do we tell the story or how does the industry tell the story about where the successes have been? And then, when Mark Carney came in as the new prime minister, I definitely heard a lot. I know a lot of people up in Alberta and in Calgary, and it was definitely a lot of chatter about people were very concerned, about what he was going to
yeah.
do. He's had very climate forward positions at the World Bank and
Mhm,
other places and stuff.
mhm,
So just
mhm.
sort of talk broadly about like what's been sort of has there been a public perception shift like with how Mark Carney is really trying to be like Canada can do both. We can provide the energy that the world needs and we can do it with a climate through a climate lens without necessarily crippling everything. Just yeah, talk about sort of some of that sentiment that you're hearing from folks who know, and it's a very broad and loaded kind of question, but
It's a broad question,
yeah,
but it's talked about a lot these days because it's become very relevant.
yeah,
And I think a lot of the story is pushed or told through the lens of energy poverty. I like to look at it that way.
mm,
Like we might have all these great aspirations, but if we freeze, or if we don't get energy to run our manufacturing world or whatever, we have a problem. We need energy, and we in Canada have a lot of energy in various sources, including hydro and other
yeah,
sources. But so it's an interesting situation. The former prime minister, who was not exactly known as a buddy of the energy industry, he made a comment back in probably 16, 17, in 2016, 2017, that it was a brilliant comment, and it was, we no longer choose between energy and environment. Sorry, we no longer choose between economy and environment. We choose both.
mm,
And I think, in spite of himself, that was a very smart comment.
yeah,
And in fact, he wound up getting, the gas, the LNG export. pipeline and the Trans Mountain oil pipeline both actually um, became a reality during his tenure. So it's funny because in spite of the previous government, we actually got some delivery to Tidewater.
Yeah.
But the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who was the Bank of Canada governor and the Bank of England governor, and in the UN climate change,
Yeah, that's what I knew he was involved in some
very
of that.
very climate oriented. He wrote a book called Values, which I read, and I read through the book, and I thought, wow, this is a strong stance. You know,
Yeah.
very environmentally leaning, and a lot of people were concerned about that.
Mhm.
I think what's happened is he's a banker, and frankly, he looked at the situation and said, "Yeah, there's aspiration, there's values, but there's business and there's feeding mouths and being, a guy in charge of the country." And so he has very much taken a centrist position in getting things done. And he's also got a very kind way in that he just hasn't been confrontational.
Mm,
He's just been very very moderate, getting out there, getting engaged, but not making enemies and getting business done.
mm,
And typically in the West here in Alberta, we aren't big fans of the federal government. We own the resource as a province. They don't. Over the decades, this has been a push pull,
yeah.
and so it's not terribly friendly territory for the federal government here. But just last week, he signed a pretty
I
significant
saw that.
MOU with our
Yeah.
premier, who politically is on the other side of the spectrum. And she's said a lot of good things in the last week or two about working with the federal government. So it's really interesting because we have a person who believes strongly in the environment and climate change and all these things, but yet when it comes to the practical matter of things, he's very businesslike. And more than anything, Canada needs independence, productivity, cash flow, all the things a
Yeah.
banker would want to see if you're coming to him for a loan.
Yep.
So I'm very encouraged, and I think generally speaking, his popularity in Canada is significantly higher than the
His
last few years
predecessor.
before he was there,
Yeah.
and so we're moving we're moving strongly in a resource development way.
Yeah.
He has publicly stated he wants Canada to be an energy superpower, which I love because we're
Mhm.
there from a ranking point of view. We just don't talk like it. We
Yeah.
act like we're number 25 when in fact we're number 4 or 5.
Yeah. I think this is because there's 3 pieces of it. Like, I've been quite impressed watching Carney from afar. I'm not up in Canada right now, but I have seen a lot of, a lot of his press conferences and some of that kind of stuff. And some of it's purely because of the battle with Trump on tariffs and what
Mhm,
that looks like and stuff. But, like, it feels like it is kind of those 3 big things. It's Canada is the 5th, 4th, 5th, 6th, whatever given day it is, largest producer of not just oil, but gas as well.
mhm,
And so, Carney's definitely been talking about that. He's been talking
mhm,
about it both in terms of what does that look like on a climate perspective? And I know you and I were kind of chatting a little bit, but I was reading some of the proposals he'd maybe put forward in the budget around he initially the rules for oil and gas were an absolute emission on the industry and it was going to cap it.
mhm,
And he's talking about changing that to be a carbon intensity based metric, which there's differences in absolute versus intensity based, but in terms of it definitely aligns with what he's talking about in terms of we want to increase production, but we want to still make sure that we're doing it with the lowest footprint instead of just
yeah,
capping it, because by doing the cap, you put a cap on industry and it means industry can't grow. So like that's been very consistent with what he's been talking about, at least from what I've seen, and stuff like that. And then the other piece is through some of these other export channels like LNG, he's been very public about we can't rely on our
mhm,
traditional export
mhm.
to the US. Like you said, like the original LNG went out through the Gulf Coast via the US, right?
Yep,
And
yep.
so, it's been a really interesting position in that regard. So I'm just kind of curious, like, you know, is that kind of like what you're kind of seeing the talk? I've heard a lot of really positive things from a lot of people in industry who were very concerned, but those 2 things in particular seem like he's willing to take the fight to Trump in terms of, you want a tariff is fine. We will find other ways and we have started to do that. And So really interesting. He hasn't backed down in that regard. And I think a lot of people, it seems from
Yeah.
afar that a lot of people have responded really well to that as well. Like,
Yeah, he's very popular right now. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a lawyer yesterday, and he's traditionally, in fact, he's from a political family that's on the other side of the spectrum, and he said, actually, he's doing a great job. So I'm
that's
hearing that a
amazing.
lot
Yeah.
from in Calgary. I'm hearing that a lot. I'm hearing that a lot from my peers in the oil and gas business. It comes with a risk to stand up and be his best friend, in the patch. Typically, I mean, this isn't like the U.S. where you have Texas and the Houston group and how they interact with, say, New York City or California. It's typical of oil producing regions. We tend to be a little bit different, but he has really acted as if he's concerned or a cheerleader of a strong resource economy, which I love.
Mm,
We are a resource nation. As Canadians, we sometimes fool ourselves and think we're tech or or pop culture or manufacturing. We're not. We are a resource nation.
yeah.
Why on earth can't we be the best at resources in the best environmental footprint?
Yeah.
That's the space we should be working on. So
Yeah.
to that end, the prime minister set up what he called a major projects office, which is, almost post-war like capital expenditures of the federal government in key areas. And the list that's been circulating, they involve ports and critical minerals and energy sources and things like this. And so one of the big goals of realigning with Alberta and the oil and gas exportability is getting one of the major projects to be, more egress of crude, not traditionally south. And you have to remember a lot of the things that we're fighting with, some of the surprises of our neighbor to the south, is for all my life, oil and gas companies in Alberta aligned with oil and gas companies in Houston. Refineries were built in Kansas or Beaumont,
Yep.
Texas, and pipelines were owned by those oil companies. And you integrated the grid north south. This was just how it was done. Companies were owned across those borders. The
Yep.
grid, of course, went north south. And these are things that we've done for generations, not thinking much about it.
Yep.
I'll jump to the auto sector. Auto sector's been under a lot of pressure between the Canada-US situation. And in the 50s, a lot of Canadian auto companies were being taken over. So the solution was, for every car sold in Canada, one was made in Canada. So that was the deal that the auto workers said years ago. Well, okay, yeah, fine. You guys can corporately take the ownership, but we want one car, one for one. Well, that's the 50s. The world, the cars don't all come from the United States anymore.
No.
And so as everything's changed, people forgot that in 64 or whenever this auto pact was signed, it was a much different world.
Mm,
Same with oil and gas. It was a much different world. The pipelines were built, the specs on pipelines, for instance, and refineries, for instance, in central US, in the Midwest, they're made for Canadian crude, right?
mm.
They're made for our version of bitumen or heavy
Yeah. The
heavy crude.
heavies.
So it's not like we can stop shipping there. Then where are they going to get the
Yeah.
feedstock? So it's not a quick fix. It's a long-term mentality change, and the prime minister has really taken to this with a positive note. It's not a not. It's a how can we do better
Mm,
uniquely, and I think it's the people are responding very favorably to it. We've re-engaged our relations with China, with India, with traditionally our partners around the world. UAE, the prime minister was just there. We're talking to everybody. We're not being so smug like we sometimes tend to be as Canadians. So we're just getting a little more global, and I think the oil industry is absolutely going to benefit,
yeah.
especially if we can diversify our markets a little bit.
Well, in the LNG piece as well, like there's been a lot of talk, particularly here in the US and stuff, around like Europe's methane rule of like import what the methane intensity needs to be for fossil fuels going into Europe. A lot of the Asian nations, whether it's Japan or South Korea and stuff like that, are putting similar kind of methane intensity type metrics in place. And to your point around the work that the Canadian industry's already done around methane reduction, um, the industry is really well positioned to be quite competitive as well on
Yeah.
on a, again, volume of energy delivered at the lowest footprint. Just because, you guys have had some of this stuff in place for a long time, and it's verifiable, it's auditable, because it's companies are used to reporting it and things like that. So it's going to be really interesting as well, I think, to see. Generally, it's gonna be interesting to see where the LNG market goes. There's a lot of different of all the different commodities. The LNG market seems to be the one that's confusing people the most, of like what their outlook looks like. But I think for Canada, I think, while it took a long time to get that LNG
Yeah.
facility up and running, um, the fact that it can deliver gas at a lower footprint is just, it's beneficial. The timing of that's just beneficial, to the story, to your point, the story that the industry can tell. And getting gas into through the Pacific into Asia is a huge market, so it's
Huge one.
huge.
Well,
Yeah,
you'd know Australia's been doing it for years.
I know, I know. It was partly why I was never very bullish on Canadian LNG, because I was like,
Yeah.
"You're gonna fight Australia and Qatar on this?" Like,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. No,
um,
I think it's been very good, and I think you're exactly right. We have clean, well-sourced from an environmental footprint product. The question always is, will the consumer pay,
yeah,
right? Uh, Consumers around the world, traders from Geneva, they like the lowest dollar,
yeah,
So, will the consumer pay? I don't know, but this is the way we do it, and we do it well, and I think we need to be a little more proud about the way we produce
telling
our
the story.
hydrocarbons in Canada, because we do have something to talk about, and the way we do it is exportable. Our
Mm.
our our standards are exportable.
Yeah, which is huge. So, final thing, one of the things, I know you've been working in the helium space recently. So I'm really kind of curious about, like, explain to people the importance of helium and, sort of some of Canada's resource in that space as well. So,
Well, Canada has, because we're big and there's not a lot of folks hanging around, we have we have a lot of resources,
yeah.
and we have a lot of critical resources, and we have things like amazing deposits of uranium and other fuel type reasons.
Mm,
We've got a lot of resources, and instead of being shy about them, we've got to embrace them and be the best at them. And that's again where the prime minister is really starting to focus. But some of those resources are needed in ways that people don't think about a lot. Helium is one of them, and I'm not sure if I'd say helium's a critical resource. It's on the list and off the list from a definition point of view. But helium is used. People don't realize helium is used a lot in imaging, medical imaging.
mm,
MRI machines all take a top up every year of helium, and that's what cools their magnets. So big market in
mm.
medical imaging, also markets in semiconductor manufacturing and space exploration. And way down the
Huge.
list is party balloons.
Yeah, I know. You say helium, everyone just assumes it's the balloons they see at the store and at parties and stuff, right? But you're right. Like medical grade helium's a big deal, and it's, um you can't, if I'm correct, if I remember any of my high school chemistry, which I probably don't, like, you can't make helium, right? Because it's like the smallest, second smallest element behind hydrogen. So you have to find it naturally occurring, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, I I generally think you're right. I
if
also
I
am not
remember
an
my
expert.
periodic table, like, I think it's the second element. But
The thing is, it's in almost every gas well in the
mm,
world. If you look at that annoying stuff that you have to strip out or do something with, helium is almost always going to be a component, but it's so small and so meaningless that it doesn't really
yeah,
matter. Till recently, people have noticed, oh, if I have a nice percentage of helium in my well, I can actually remove it, and sell it at a
economically, yeah.
2 times the order of magnitude of what I sell my natural gas for.
Mm,
So, places like Qatar, there's a lot of helium extraction because there's a lot of gas.
mm.
Um, but what's happening in North America, I think a lot of it happened a few years ago in the US, like on the fringes of the Hugoton Basin and
Yep,
Kansas and some of those places. We're high in helium. I think West
yep.
Texas. There's
Yep,
there's
little
places
bit
where
out in some of the Rockies as well,
Yep.
so,
So the
yeah.
gas is got a little bit more content of helium, and therefore it's pretty quickly economic. So in the Canadian side, there's probably about 12 of us operators, and the helium sweet spot in the gas
Cool.
is down on the intersection of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana. So you can
Yep.
kind of pick where that is, and that area seems to be where most of the helium people are chasing the resource. I've been involved with a company that's been public for maybe a year and a half as a director, and we've just gone private. And the helium space is very new, so in the public
Yeah.
markets, it's all over the map. So we think there's more access to capital on the private side. That's probably going to be what I'm doing full time in the next while. We're just completing this week actually a well, um, so there is a market for helium. There's a market for liquefaction of such, but it's tiny quantities compared to this natural gas stuff. You know, it's not an LNG tanker, but at 3 or 4 or $500 US an MCF, it's it's economic. So it's a different space, and it's maybe critical minerals, right? It's it's needed.
Cool. No, very cool. And I think it'll be great to, as you guys are working through this and stuff like that. Again, as you said, Canada's a really resource rich country, and yeah, another really interesting kind of one that's, yeah, like you said, not always on people's radar with with helium.
Yeah.
So very cool. Darcy, it's been an absolute pleasure. Lots of fun things to unpack and stuff like that. But yeah, very cool to sort of see how the story is evolving in Canada. I think it's how do we figure out developing the resources we need, but doing it in a really kind of environmentally conscious way. And I think it's yeah, like you said, it's something that Canada should be really proud of. And it'll be interesting to see how the public perception around that sort of starts to change a little bit, and
Yeah.
if it starts to change as well, because
If
that's
it
always a
stays the
big
same.
hurdle. So,
Well, I'm always optimistic. As the former prime minister said, we choose economy and
mhm,
environment. So I think we can be profitable, efficient, and actually good for the environment as an industry, and that's worth celebrating.
yeah, love it. Thanks so much, Darcy.
Thank you. It's been great.